So it is National Cookie Exchange Day, and we have our community wellness dietitian, Pam Patty, here with us, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about not just doing a cookie exchange, but exchanging some of your ingredients in your cookies or your other baked goods to just try to get to a little bit of a healthier place.
Okay.
Yes?
Great.
Okay.
Yes. And I think one thing that's fun about a cookie is it's just a treat, right? It's not supposed to be the foundation of a meal. It's not supposed to provide all of our nutritional requirements that the body needs on a daily basis. It's a treat. So it certainly should taste good. And I think there's a variety of different ways that we get flavor into a cookie, and the sweet part of it is kind of my first thought. Different types of sweeteners. You've got solids, things like, sugar form, if you will, a crystallized form of a sugar. You've got different, like white sugar, brown sugar. You've got liquid sugars or liquid sweeteners. I think maybe depending on the age of the person and maybe the culture that you come from, Southern cooking had a lot of molasses in it. Honey, there's a lot of times you can talk about local honey helps people that they've got allergies or whatever. Right. Wouldn't that be a great way to say, oh, I need to eat 6 cookies because I've got an allergy? But what you want to remember is when you're going to use liquid sweeteners that you have to adjust for the other liquids that are in your recipe,
right? Okay,
because that you don't want to get that balance to be undone there. And then this is an opportunity if we like chocolate.
Yes, please.
Yes, exactly right. And I think sometimes we think of chocolate as this thing, but it's actually a formula that has a variety of ingredients to it. And a lot of the research that's coming out, for those of us that do love chocolate, is the higher the cacao in it, which is the polyphenol component of like a cacao bean for the chocolate, we're going to get 60% is a pretty good break point for the bitterness not being so bitter that you don't even want to try to eat it. So Ghirardelli is a very nice brand. There's a variety of different chocolatiers that are out there. Hershey's, Nestle's, right? Powdered form, that's a nice way to get it into your cookie recipe depending. Obviously a chip is going to be a bigger chunk of it, so if you want to have more consistency throughout your batter, then maybe this is a way to consider to go with a powdered form of it. Okay, so coming to the fat component of what your cookie is usually going to have for the recipe, you can do butter, you can do some oils, you can even do something like, this is kind of one of my favorites, is when I want a crispy cookie. I'd like to do the coconut oil. And when you're looking for this in the marketplace, try to think of something that is unrefined or at least cold pressed is my understanding to be the way that we can have the highest quality of the coconut oil without kind of losing either some nutritional component to it or the texture of it as well. And this is what we're going to call a saturated fat, which is, just by a really quick definition, solid at room temperature. Right. So when it's not really hot in your house, this should stay as a nice solid. When it gets to be a little warm, sometimes you'll see that it's a little more liquid. Okay.
So Grandma's cookie recipe often has Crisco in it. Okay. So is this a good substitute for that? Like, what's the way to?
I'm not a big fan of those kind of, what I'm going to call those, the plant solids forms, the shortenings, right? Because I think sometimes you have to be really careful of partially hydrogenated fats.
Right.
And that's, in a health capacity, is going to be associated with trans fats. And as much as I think sometimes we say that butter or these solid fats are more saturated and that's supposed to be a negative in the human health, there's really more evidence that the trans fats from an industrial component are going to maybe give us a worse outcome. So maybe stay towards this. Okay. And I know some of those recipes are very cherished and we don't really have substitutes for those ingredients. So those exchanges are a little bit more difficult to make. And so I'm not here to say, oh, yeah, no problems. Maybe experiment and see if the outcomes are similar to what you remember from your childhood, because we don't want to mess those memories up, for sure. And one thing I just want to point out about the butters is European butters. Kerrygold is one of those. I'm not sure if this is really a European butter, but it's got 85% butter fat in it. And usually the European butters are going to have about higher amount of butter fat in them. They're just going to act differently for texture and ultimately flavor, and certainly nutrition will be impacted by that. So just be careful of not careful, but mindful of what you're putting in there. I think it should be a lovely outcome, but it may be different than what you're used to if you have a different butter.
Okay.
Okay. this is not necessarily for the cookies, but when we're talking about oils in general, make sure, especially if you're doing olive oil, that we get this cold pressed again. See, we said cold pressed here, and then what we also kind of want to be thoughtful of, is to make sure that you've got what we call an opaque container. Light is one of the big things that can degrade nutrition as well as heat, so try to make sure it's not a clear bottle. If we do get a clear bottle, move it into a lovely opaque container, right? Don't you want to just use it for something?
It's adorable. Well, maybe not that.
I don't know. We've got some people that are so about olive oil, they're like, we should start drinking it. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, and then if you are trying to use an oil in a heat environment, so like I'm going to do some deep fat frying, and again, we need to move away that's horrible, right? But make sure that we have the appropriate oil for that. This is a grapeseed oil, peanut oil. They have what they call a smoke point that is going to be able to tolerate a higher heat. So just kind of be mindful.
So not your olive oil.
Usually, to me, for olive oil, I want to have, especially if I'm getting this extra virgin olive oil, I want to try to maybe use it in more of a cold application. Like if I was going to take some balsamic vinegar and make a lovely dip for some beautiful bread, right? Or if I'm going to put this into a hummus and I'm going to blend that up with some chickpeas. If I'm going to saute with it, maybe just some regular olive oil or just virgin oil and not extra EVOO, whatever. So just be thoughtful of, usually the more processed it is as far as the extra virgin olive oil, that's usually a higher price point, but the flavor might be what you're really getting for in that. And so if we're going to use heat toward it, it maybe doesn't need to have the flavor as much, but we want to make sure that we can use it appropriately. Great. Okay, so a big part of a cookie recipe is your flour. If I'm a gluten-free cookie person, I'm going to have some different options. There's a ton of gluten-free flours out there. I'm just going to encourage you to look at that little thing. If you are a gluten-free person, you already know that that's what you look for on your packaging. And that's just going to help to zone me in on what I should be considering. And it's not that you're going to be able to take your grandma's favorite chocolate chip cookie and just use these flours and get the same outcome, because obviously she didn't use that flour. So it's going to probably take you searching a little bit on the internet to find out what you need to do as well to incorporate these different flours and make sure that your outcome is going to be at least comparable.
When they sell blends now, right? The gluten-free flour blend.
Yes. And I think you're going to have some things that are going to have to stabilize some structure, because gluten, I know everybody's, for whatever perception you have, objectively, it's to help maintain structure. So usually like in a yeasted baked good, we're going to have something that has a rise to it. And once the carbon dioxide is all cooked off or whatever, now we've got this structure because gluten was able to retain it. Fortunately for cookies, we're not really trying to do like a yeasted bread loaf. So we don't need to have a lot of gluten in the first place. So I think that really helps us to really, if I have to move into a gluten-free baking experience, I would really suggest that you do a cookie recipe or even like a waffle or a pancake recipe. And that way, because you don't need a lot of leavening anyway. So I think that'll help with that.
So that makes these exchanges possible.
Yes, I love that, yes. And if I'm going to exchange, then it doesn't mean that I shouldn't ever use all-purpose flour. If I have a recipe that says I need a whole cup and a half of all-purpose flour, maybe I start exchanging a half a cup. And then maintain the base. Now, again, if it's gluten-free, I'm not saying that you should do this, but what you can try to do is start with the base flour, and then if you want to try to exchange some things in and out. One of the easiest ways if you're trying to get a whole grain is using just either like old-fashioned rolled oats or steel-cut oats, put them in a blender and get a flour from that, and that could be an easy way to exchange and start to incorporate a whole grain. Not necessarily, we did talk about this too. Oats are not, they are gluten-free. Sometimes when there's this intentional, is it a gluten-free oat, it's talking about the cross-contamination of the processing plant of where it could have come from. But oats are gluten-free naturally. Alrighty. And I think one of the other things that we had mentioned too, when you're talking about the leavening agents, this is just a little thing, but sometimes people either maybe have a reaction to aluminum when it's in their baking powder, or possibly they get that tinny flavor that comes out of it. This is a lovely brand. It's Rumford. It's from, 1859, and it's aluminum free. It's also double acting, which when you do have aluminum in a brand, it was to help to get 2 different times of the activation of the carbon dioxide to make. So Moisture starts it, and then when you put it into the oven, the heat also continues to give that action. So that's just a little bit of the chemistry of why we put a leavening agent in there and why they've been combined together in a baking powder versus baking soda and then an acid, which would do the same thing.
Okay.
Okay. And then I think one of the ingredients that people talk about a lot too is salt. Sometimes in a cookie recipe, don't try to go with sodium free. Even if it's just a little bit of salt, there is a chemical reason, and not like, artificial chemicals, but there's a scientific chemistry that has to happen. And so all of the ingredients come together, and you do need to have some salt in your recipe.
So it's not just for flavor.
Exactly.
Okay.
There is a reason for it to be there. And we were talking about just the different flavor profiles. Iodized salt has some health benefits, for your thyroid. But flavor-wise, some of these other salts can really be nice. And again, in just little amounts. I think a big thing now we have is like cracked salts. When you put that on the top of like a cookie, a caramel sauce.
Caramel, yes.
Yeah. So again, you're not necessarily going to have this amazing nutritional aspect of that, but you're going to get this lovely crunchy, salty flavor as you take your first bite. And like, who doesn't love that if you like salted caramel?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And then lastly, but certainly not leastly, are your eggs. I think a big education piece is just to remember, just because something says cage-free doesn't mean that it is pasture-raised. Chickens, the whole industry, you're trying to do this mass amount of eggs. They used to be very contained. They were in cages all the time. And then the thought was, oh, yay, now that they're cage-free, they're happy, they're bucolic, there's going to be just much better eggs. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be out in the pasture where they can get to their natural food sources of grubs and bugs and all that good stuff. So just continue to look for your packaging information. It should be able to direct you to, is it pasture raised, is it cage free, or is it just a regular egg that came from?
Okay, so with our eggs, the cage free, the pastured, it's not just a matter of whether the animals are kept humanely, it impacts your nutrition.
Right, because as with humans, when you're stressed, your health outcome is affected by that.
Right.
Same thing for animals. When they're stressed, their outcomes are going to be affected. So if they're giving us a food product like an egg, that certainly comes to reason that could be affected negatively as it comes to us as a food source.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Great. Okay, so comment in the comment section below this video and tell us about your cookie exchange, what cookies you love to make, and if you have any great ideas for making some healthy substitutions in those recipes.